A pair of Native American man and woman were dancing in the grass. They were performing a hunting dance, but in reality, they were the prince and princess of the chiefdom. The newly arrived white man, Smith, stood nearby watching. However, the two danced so joyfully that they didn't even notice Smith's presence. Not far from Smith, beside the newly built base of the white settlers, a group of Native American warriors was investigating the unfamiliar outsiders. When they encountered the white men for the first time, they first sniffed the scent of the white man. Finding nothing unusual, they then patted the chest of the white man. Even the white men's hats and the gunpowder bags hanging from their waists seemed novel to them. They casually climbed up the wooden houses the whites had just started building, but since they didn't detect any danger, they called out to the prince and princess, who were playing nearby. Princess Pocahontas and her brother had just managed to bring troops on patrol, so they were reluctant to turn back. Unexpectedly, at that moment, they happened to spot the slightly melancholic white man. The two of them exchanged glances for a moment, but Pocahontas was pulled away by her brother. Smith did not know that, because of this glance, he would avoid death and would later leave behind an unforgettable love in the midst of bloodshed. Because the whites had established a base at the mouth of the river, the Native Americans soon realized disaster was imminent. The white settlers began capturing Native Americans as slaves, and those who tried to escape were shot on the spot. Other captured Native Americans now felt the fear of being shot dead. Smith could not stand it. He dragged the man who was about to shoot into the river and pressed him down into the water. This successfully calmed the emotions of the enslaved Native Americans and prevented a riot. Of course, this scene did not escape the notice of the Native American scouts. Due to food rotting, the white captain urgently needed to trade with the Native Americans for food. However, the Native Americans had no need for the whites' goods. Their chiefdom was located deep in the jungle upstream of the Great River. The captain decided to send a few death squads deep into the jungle to negotiate with the king. Smith, as a death row prisoner, was included among them. If they could secure food to help the whites survive the approaching cold winter in the New World, he would be pardoned for his crimes and honored for helping the British secure their first colony. Led by Native American slaves, the group traveled upstream, but halfway through, the slaves led them into a swamp and escaped. Smith got separated from his teammates. Now, he needed to find dry land. He knew that moving in the water made him vulnerable, and this was his most fragile moment. An arrow hit Smith's armor, and he realized the danger. He immediately put on his helmet. However, when Smith raised his gun to aim, Native American soldiers emerged from all sides. Some knocked Smith's pistol away, while others struck him with a club, knocking him over. Now, Smith had become a prisoner of the Native Americans. To prevent Smith from recognizing the direction, the Native Americans blindfolded him and then pushed him into the jungle. Once in the tribe, Smith was allowed to remove his blindfold. He saw hundreds of people gathered around, cheering. It was clear they were celebrating their warrior's return. Smith was pushed into a large grass hut, where the crowd was divided into two rows. At the end, an elder sat like a king presiding over the court. As the elder sat down, the cheering immediately stopped, and everyone became solemn. Even the rafters above were guarded by warriors who resembled cheetahs, protecting the elder. Smith then realized that he was face to face with the king of the chiefdom. The king asked Smith if he came from the sky. Smith could understand a little, so he replied that he came from an island called England. A man next to the king helped translate. As it seemed he could understand some of Smith's English, the king ordered Smith to leave the Native American land. Smith didn't understand the words, but he understood the king's gestures, so he replied that the large ships wouldn't leave until spring. Since Smith wanted to trade gunpowder for food, he crouched by the fire. The people, confused, gathered around, but they were soon frightened by the effects of the gunpowder explosion. The noise attracted warriors outside, and the situation quickly became tense. This made Pocahontas, who wanted to protect Smith, hesitant. After the king spoke to the man with the blue snake hanging from his ear, a person wearing a death mask performed a ritual on Smith. Then, the people restrained Smith. By the time he realized this was an execution, it was too late. Fortunately, at the critical moment, Pocahontas threw herself onto Smith, forcing the soldiers to stop the execution. Pocahontas, the youngest daughter of the king, was deeply favored by him because she knelt down and pleaded for Smith, asking her people to hold a welcoming ceremony for him. Smith was lucky enough to survive. The next day, when Smith woke up, the tribe treated him as one of their own and offered him breakfast corn to eat. After breakfast, he went to find Pocahontas, but because of the language barrier, he didn't know how to express his gratitude. Pocahontas understood his intention. She pointed at Smith's features and taught him the local language. while also learning English words from him to demonstrate the flowing water and wind. Pocahontas even used body language. After spending some time with Smith, Pocahontas went to comb her father's hair. The king had over 100 children, but he always favored Pocahontas, allowing her to be close to him. By noon, Smith saw that the tribe was building a house for him to settle in. Feeling moved, Smith joined the soldiers in their work. Not only did he laugh with the men, but he also learned to call out to his friends in the Native American way. Because of Smith's active participation, the leader personally smoked him, seemingly believing that one day he would become one of them. With dark skin, the women even trusted him enough to let their babies crawl onto Smith. Smith knew that the tribe's unconditional trust in him was because Pocahontas had taken a liking to him. So, whenever Pocahontas needed him, Smith would stay by her side. One day, a child in the tribe drowned. Smith, being a pirate, handled the situation with ease. With his help, the child quickly coughed up the water. The tribe thanked Smith by performing the touching ceremony for him. As Smith became beloved by the people, Pocahontas personally gave him the title of a wise man. From that day on, the two began to develop feelings for each other, slowly growing closer. In the warmth of love, Smith felt a sense of rebirth that only a death row prisoner could understand. However, he cherished Pocahontas' feelings so much that he couldn't bring himself to cross the important boundaries between men and women. When autumn arrived, Smith was fishing in the river with the tribe. However, the king, in the temple and in the name of the gods, released Smith, allowing him to return to the white man's base. Although Smith knew this day would come, he didn't expect the king's trust in him to come so quickly. The king's condition was that the whites must return to England by spring. When it was time to part, Pocahontas reluctantly bid Smith farewell, but she wasn't sad, because she loved Smith. She hoped he would be happy and content. On the way back, Smith was once again blindfolded. When the mask was finally removed, he saw that he had finally returned to the white man's base. The Native American brothers treated Smith courteously, and as a gift for his return home, they gave him a wild deer and 2 large turkeys. Once Smith entered the base, he realized that the place was ravaged by plague and its population had dwindled. Some of the seriously ill were lying on the ground, waiting to die, while the children described the horrific conditions at the base in full detail. However, because Smith had returned, the person who had temporarily taken his position now confronted him. The captain had already returned to England and was now aiming to become the leader. So, in front of Smith, he executed a man as a show of power. But instead of the people recognizing this brutal man, they rejected him and gave Smith the captain's silver medal, collectively acknowledging Smith as their leader. But even though Smith became the leader, he didn't feel much happiness. He caressed the feather Pocahontas had given him, unsure of how he could be with her. To deal with the plague, Smith began to overhaul the base. The first step was to dig a well to ensure that the people had clean water to drink. The second step was to boil all the clothes and belts in hot water. When there were only 38 people left at the base, Smith finally managed to eliminate the plague. However, famine still loomed ahead. As winter approached, the sturgeon, the easiest fish to catch, had disappeared. The last person to die was even eaten, with one of their arms consumed by the others. Now, everyone was unsure how to survive the coming winter. As snowflakes began to fall, people were cold and hungry, only able to huddle together, shivering. One morning, a pair of Native Americans appeared at the base's gate carrying food. The leader was Pocahontas, and the white men knew that this was the food they desperately needed. They welcomed the Native Americans in. Though the two tribes had no common language and harbored animosity, their expressions showed mutual comfort. Seeing Pocahontas, Smith simply urged her not to take risks, not to let the king think that his daughter had betrayed her people. But Pocahontas asked Smith why he hadn't come to visit her. Smith could only remain silent. Given their current situation, love between the two tribes seemed impossible. Nevertheless, despite the mutual hostility, the white men still knelt and regarded Pocahontas as their savior when she left. After the spring came, Smith went to trade with his tribe. On the shore, he encountered Pocahontas again. The two had some private time and embraced tightly in the woods. That day, Smith asked Pocahontas if she needed to return to the tribe to live. But Pocahontas did not respond, because she understood that this was not the life Smith wanted. As Pocahontas didn't respond, Smith asked her if she would follow him back to England. This time, Pocahontas replied that she would accept anything, even an uncertain future, as long as she could be with Smith. But peaceful times did not last long. After the weather warmed, the Native Americans discovered that not only had the white men not left, but they had also begun planting corn in the wild. The Native Americans finally realized that these outsiders did not intend to leave their land. The king, holding the corn seedlings, questioned Pocahontas, asking who had given the corn seeds to the white men. Not getting an answer from his daughter, the king grew even angrier, confirming that the white men weren't leaving. The king decided to send soldiers that day. Before the main force could leave, Pocahontas ran desperately. She didn't want to see Smith die before her eyes, so she betrayed her people and went to warn the white men. By nightfall, Pocahontas had finally arrived at the white men's base. However, Smith could not leave. The captain's ship had not yet returned, and they actually had nowhere to go. Thus, Pocahontas had no choice but to ask Smith to plead for peace with her father. But Smith countered, asking why the king would agree to peace, considering that he was the invader. For a moment, Pocahontas fell silent, sadly resting her head on Smith's chest. Before dawn, Smith wanted Pocahontas to follow him into the base to avoid the war, but Pocahontas did not agree. Pocahontas ran away. Smith knew that if he returned to the tribe, he would face severe punishment. At that moment, his eyes were filled with tears. The next morning, under Pocahontas's gaze, the two tribes clashed fiercely. Since the white men had prepared early, the Native Americans suffered heavy casualties. However, they also reached the outskirts of the white men's base, using cold weapons to kill several white men. Smith watched his Native American brothers die before his eyes, and he too was in great pain. He ordered a retreat, deciding to defend but not attack. The traitorous Pocahontas was brought before the king. According to the chiefdom's laws, she was supposed to be executed, but the elderly king couldn't bring himself to do it. He ordered Pocahontas to be exiled and severed his father-daughter relationship with her. At the white men's base, Smith had temporarily held the fort, but the Native Americans had surrounded the base, pulling up crops, poisoning the water, and preventing anyone from fishing in the river. Despair once again covered the emotions of everyone at the base. Aside from worrying about the lives of his men, Smith had to split his attention and think about the whereabouts of Pocahontas. Sometime later, someone brought Smith news about Pocahontas. It turned out that this person had secretly gone to the Native American lands to fish and had happened to see Pocahontas being exiled further upstream. Along the way, the chiefs had already begun offering bounties for the beautiful but unprotected Pocahontas. Smith's men suggested that Smith take Pocahontas into the base, using her as a hostage. However, Smith refused to use Pocahontas to blackmail the king. He believed that if it weren't for Pocahontas's kindness, they would have starved to death long ago. They could not imprison Pocahontas, because Smith refused to take Pocahontas as a hostage. Some of the officers began to use his relationship with her to severely injure him. These remarks stirred the emotions of the men, and the people rallied together and relieved Smith of his command. Smith was bound and whipped, then hung upside down to sleep that night. After the whipping, Smith was sent to the surrounding woods to work as a woodcutter. In fact, he had become a slave. Under the new leader's command, the white men took the initiative and used Smith's name to capture Pocahontas, then bombarded the surrounding tribes with cannons. The Native Americans, who were used to hunting on land, had no way of dealing with such weapons. Pocahontas, aboard the ship, was deceived by the new leader into thinking that Smith was bringing her into the base. She left the ship willingly. It wasn't until Pocahontas was brought to the white men's base and found that Smith wasn't there that she realized she had been tricked. Sometime later, a fleet from England returned to the Americas, bringing supplies and reinforcements. On the ship, there were cannons, and they began to bombard the backward chiefdom. Now, the tables had turned in favor of the English, and because the white men began to ignore Pocahontas, she was finally allowed to move around and found Smith working as a woodcutter. She learned that Smith had made great sacrifices to protect her, but Smith hoped that Pocahontas would take the opportunity to leave the white men's base, return to the tribe, and ask for her father's forgiveness. He didn't want their father-daughter relationship to be pushed to an irreversible point. However, Smith was ultimately unable to persuade Pocahontas. She couldn't leave Smith, who was treated like a slave. She wanted to stay by his side. Days later, the captain finally completed his show of force against the Native Americans. He personally found Smith and told him that the king had pardoned him of all crimes. Smith was now tasked with exploring the east to find India, draw a map, and return to England. This mission was almost like sentencing Smith to death again. And at the base, Pocahontas, unaware of the situation, met a white woman who had come with the ship. She was dressed up to resemble Smith's Pocahontas, but walking in high heels was something she just couldn't get used to. When they met again, the naive Pocahontas was dressed in English clothes, thinking this would make Smith happy. However, Smith remained preoccupied. trying to force Pocahontas to return to her father, so she wouldn't just stay in the base waiting for his return. Before leaving, Smith instructed a friend to tell Pocahontas 2 months later that he had drowned if there was no word from him. The next morning, Smith left the Americas. 2 months later, Pocahontas learned of Smith's death in a shipwreck, and she was heartbroken. After Smith returned to England, the white settlers left in the Americas were now nearly all hostile to the Indians. They raided the chief's village, burning houses, chasing and killing anyone, regardless of age or gender. The surviving Indians had no choice but to flee into the jungle, so Pocahontas never had the chance to find her father or her people again. From then on, Pocahontas lived alone in the enemy's base. Though saddened, she didn't forget her kind heart. She delivered water to the prisoners. This scene was witnessed by John, who had only just arrived. John already knew Pocahontas' story and wanted to comfort her, but Pocahontas had an empty look in her eyes, and her heart ached for the man who had died and the fate of her people. One day, when John spoke to her, she didn't reject him, and that was the beginning of his long life beside her. Adjusting to life among the whites was not easy for Pocahontas. She needed to learn to read and write, so John started teaching her letter by letter. But Pocahontas didn't even understand the concept of time, such as an hour or a minute. This was something she had never encountered before and found difficult to grasp. Sometimes, John himself was stumped by these seemingly simple but hard-to-explain questions. Months passed before Pocahontas finally understood the concept of time, and during that time, a new group of white settlers arrived. They brought crop seeds for the legendary Indian princess to create a better life. John built a small house for Pocahontas outside the base. Then, they planted tobacco around the house, and Pocahontas felt freedom again. She naturally loved nature, so she was delighted with the 2 cows John had bought. This brought a smile back to her face. One day, John finally proposed to Pocahontas. Pocahontas understood the meaning of the proposal, but she wished that it was Smith, not John, who was asking. However, since Smith had already died, she tearfully agreed to marry the only man she could rely on. The priest strongly opposed John marrying an uncivilized Indian, believing the marriage would be a disgrace to the whites. He kept urging John to consider his people's reputation and the honor of the country, but John held firm and didn't back down. The captain, who could help John make decisions, supported the marriage. The wedding was conducted in the traditional white man's style, and John married the bride of his dreams through his persistence. But right after the wedding, Pocahontas fell seriously ill at home. John could only take care of her and patiently wait, hoping that one day Pocahontas would smile again. Eventually, Pocahontas realized she had missed one lover and couldn't bear to hurt John, who loved her so deeply. It was only at Pocahontas' initiative that they finally had physical intimacy. Then, she naturally gave birth to a son for John. 5 years later, Pocahontas' child could walk, and John's marriage suddenly gained national attention in England. King James invited them to return to England so he could personally meet the Indian princess who had married into England. Pocahontas didn't pay much attention to the king's matter. She went to the base to trade and overheard people talking. The Smith, who had crossed the Eastern Ocean, had drifted at sea for 5 years. Although he hadn't found India, he was rescued by pirates and returned to England. When Pocahontas got home, she cried. She told John that she had already married Smith and therefore shouldn't be his wife. Fortunately, John, with his gentle nature, didn't get angry. He explained to Pocahontas that love and marriage were 2 different concepts. Soon, the family boarded a large ship to England, but to Pocahontas' surprise, she saw many Indian soldiers on board. The leader of these soldiers was her uncle. He told Pocahontas that the king was still alive. The king had exiled Pocahontas to his land, so he felt responsible for following her to England to protect her. A month later, Pocahontas and her uncle arrived in England, where they witnessed a completely new world. There were not only tall city walls, but also crowded markets and a wide variety of goods. What amazed Pocahontas even more was that the doors could be transparent. The king sent a carriage to take them to the palace. After getting off the carriage, Pocahontas, who had never seen a horse before, stared at the gentle horses for a long time. The palace, several stories high, far exceeded Pocahontas' imagination. The people around the palace, seeing Indians for the first time, crowded around to watch. The king hosted a grand reception for Pocahontas, but Pocahontas wasn't particularly happy. She carefully looked around at the ministers. After the reception, Pocahontas met her uncle in the palace garden. She apologized to him and asked him to plead with her father on her behalf, hoping one day to receive her people's forgiveness. But her uncle didn't respond. He turned and walked away coldly, having lost her homeland and many Indian soldiers' lives. Pocahontas could only be seen as a traitor. Her apology felt insignificant as she watched her uncle walk away. Pocahontas couldn't hide the sadness on her face. Unexpectedly, at the end of the garden path, Pocahontas saw a man riding towards her. Smith, after surviving numerous dangers, had drawn a map of the Pacific Islands and was able to enter the palace to meet Pocahontas. Walking down the long garden path, Smith told Pocahontas that she had been his motivation to survive the storms. Now, all he could do was wish Pocahontas happiness. As for the deception when he left, Smith also felt deeply guilty. When they reached a pond, Pocahontas's heart finally no longer harbored resentment. She gave Smith a small smile, one of release and emotion. When Smith left, Pocahontas stood on a tall tree to catch one last glimpse of his figure. Inside the room, John painfully watched his wife through the window. He couldn't be sure if Pocahontas would leave him and their child to follow Smith. John wandered in the garden, not knowing how to help his wife untangle her heart. Unexpectedly, Pocahontas came up to him. She took his arm and asked with a smile when they would go home. "I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time."